To give you the standard history of Katyn, we should step back to a little bit of the history of Soviet-Polish relations. The Bolshevik Revolution had taken place, of course, in November 1917. Poland had declared its independence. Polish nationalists had declared the independence of Poland. The Soviets, the Bolsheviks, had agreed with this. But the Polish nationalists, with the aid of the Western Allies, invaded Soviet Russia in 1918. There ensued a war. Tides of war went back and forth, but ultimately the Soviet state was so weakened that in 1920 they signed with the new Polish state the Treaty of Riga. And under the Treaty of Riga, a large part of Western Soviet Russia, consisting of the western half of Belarusia, the western half of Ukraine, were ceded to Poland. Now, these areas had never been predominantly Polish in population. They were to the east of the line, ultimately called the Curzon Line, which the Allies recommended as a border between Poland and Soviet Russia, but the Polish government didn't agree with that. And so Poland ended up with these two areas in the east of its country, formerly in the west of Soviet Russia, with majorities of non-Polish populations, Belarusians, Ukrainians, Jews, and so on. In September 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, and as everyone expected, beat the Polish army very quickly. Many Polish troops withdrew to the east, away from the advancing Germans. The Polish government and many soldiers gathered on the Romanian border and prepared to enter Romania, which they did on September the 17th, leaving Poland without a legal government. Now, around the 10th of September, the Germans told the Soviets that the Polish government had lost control of Poland, and therefore Poland had no functioning government any longer, and therefore there was no longer a Polish state. That's important because in August 1939, before the outbreak of the war, before the German invasion of Poland, the Soviet Union and Germany had signed a non-aggression pact, sometimes called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Anti-communists like to call it the Hitler-Stalin Pact because they like to yoke the names of Hitler and Stalin together. But that's what it was. It was a non-aggression pact, but it did contain a secret codicil. And one of the secret codicils stated that Eastern Poland would be in the Soviet sphere of influence. Now, pretty clear that what the Soviets wanted to do was to keep the German army as far away from the Soviet border as they possibly could. And so this was a way to do it. The sphere of influence meant that this was a large part of Eastern Poland that the German army could not remain in, and therefore would be a buffer between the German army, which is now, of course, much closer to the Soviet border because the German army had conquered Western Poland. It would be a buffer between the German army and the former Soviet border. The Germans informed Soviets that since the Polish state no longer existed because it no longer had a government, even a government in exile, then new states might be formed, would be formed, in what had been Western Poland, unless the Red Army entered that area and took control of it. We know what they meant. What they meant was they would set up a fascist Ukrainian nationalist state in this area, a state closely allied with Nazi Germany, and of course that was unacceptable to the Soviets. So, the Soviets sent in the Red Army, and they took prisoner those Polish soldiers who had either been stationed in eastern Poland or had retreated to eastern Poland and had not gone into internment in Romania or elsewhere. So the Soviets in September, October 1939 found themselves with a very large number, many tens of thousands, of Polish prisoners of war. They pretty soon let the enlisted men go, and they then had the officers and some other figures as prisoners. And these they kept in 3 camps. One not too far from Kharkov, which is in Ukraine, and one not too far from the city of Kalinin, which is now called Tver in Russia, and one not too far from the city of Smolensk, and that area was called Katyn. And that area, that name becomes sort of the name for all of these, the ensuing story about the massacres, because in March 1943, the Germans unearthed the bodies of, I don't know exactly, but 4,000 or so Polish soldiers who had been shot and buried, and the Germans claimed that the Soviets had shot them in 1940. The Soviets, of course, did not agree with this. They said that was a Nazi propaganda lie. But the Polish government in exile, which was always extremely anti-communist, and more anti-communist in many respects than anti-German, and was now in London, the Polish government in exile sent representatives to Katyn. The Germans invited them and treated them well, and these representatives agreed with the German story. They also blamed the Soviets. Now, the Polish government in exile was supposedly an ally of the Western Allies plus the Soviet Union, and at war with Nazi Germany. So the Soviets declared that this was unacceptable behavior by an ally and broke diplomatic relations with the Polish government in exile as a result of their agreeing with the German account. Really, their collaboration with the Germans. Collaboration just means working with, and they certainly worked with them. All right. So this was a major propaganda story that the Germans spread throughout occupied Europe, that the Soviets were mass murderers and they would commit further Katyn massacres if the Red Army was to defeat the Germans, and that was essentially the purpose of the German actions here. In around June 1943, the Germans issued a report, printed up back in Germany, about their story, and documented their version of events. In September 1943, the Red Army recaptured Smolensk, and shortly thereafter recaptured the area a little bit to the west of Smolensk, known as Katyn, and where all of these Polish soldiers' bodies had been unearthed. The Soviets formed their own commission called the Burdenko Commission, after the doctor, the medical man who was asked to head it, Dr. Burdenko. They studied the Katyn area, the bodies, did a lot of interviews, as the Germans had done, and in 1944 produced a report that claimed that, in fact, it had been the Germans who had shot all of these Poles, whose bodies were interred at Katyn. That became the Soviet story up until about 1988 or 89. As we'll see, Mikhail Gorbachev changed it. The Allies went along with this story. They claimed to agree with it. And some reports, unofficial reports issued. But as a result of the Cold War, starting in the late 1940s sometime, the Allies reversed themselves and began to agree with the account of the a Polish government in exile. That is to say, started to agree that it had been the Soviets who had shot all these Poles. And that became not only the Polish nationalists, but the Allied, the Western account from then on. There was a big congressional hearings in 1952, which were set up to kind of publicize this view. And that became the Allied story. So the Polish nationalists, of course, produced more literature to support their side. Anti-communist propagandists in the West did likewise. The Soviets continued to repeat that it had in fact been the Germans and stood by the Burdenko report. In late 1988, or sometime in 1988, Mikhail Gorbachev's regime in the Soviet Union decided that they would admit to Soviet guilt. It's interesting that we know now that they did not have any evidence of Soviet guilt, but they admitted to it, and that was a big story. Around 1989, the Soviets found transit reports, lists of Polish prisoners who had been shipped out of the prisoner of war camps, the 3 prisoner of war camps where they had been held, the one in Ukraine near Kharkov, which is called Piatichatki, the one in not too far from Kalinin, now Tver, which was called Ostashkov, and the one near Katyn, which was called Kozelsk. The Soviet regime under Gorbachev uncovered the transit reports, the records of the Polish prisoners who had been shipped out of these camps in the spring of 1940. They had been shipped to Kharkov, Kalinin, now Tver, and Smolensk, and then there were no further records of them. In late 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev handed over to Boris Yeltsin, who was about to become the first president of independent Russia, right? The Soviet Union was falling apart. Gorbachev handed over to him a bunch of documents which have become known as Closed Packet Number 1. These documents were allegedly found a top secret file, accessible only to Soviet leaders, and they purported to prove that Stalin, Beria, and other members of the Politburo had ordered the execution of all these Poles in 1940, in March 1940. Okay, so those documents are handed over by Boris Yeltsin to Lech Walesa, at that time the president of Poland. They are published in the newspapers, facsimiles are published online, published in a a Russian historical journal, and that seemed to be it, okay? That seemed to be good documentation that the Soviets were guilty. That is the standard history, and that remains the standard history. So, just to sum up, the standard history is March and April 1940, the Polish prisoners in these 3 camps were shipped to the NKVD and were shot there, executed there, and buried nearby. That became the standard story. The interesting and important detail here is that there's no record of them being shot. There's only record of them being shipped out of the camps, and there the record stops. So, that's the standard version. It remains the standard version. Has been elaborated to some extent by large books, one published by Yale University Press, one published in England, many other accounts, and it is taken as a done deal. This is a closed issue. No one is permitted to question this. If you question it, then there's something wrong with you. It's not legitimate to question this. This is the standard version, and that is the version that I decided to go on to research. Well, I have not actually discovered any evidence independently. What I have done is to study the evidence that has been produced by others and added it up somewhat differently. I noticed in I would say, around the year 2000, that a certain number of Russian researchers had begun to claim that the documents in closed packet number 1 were forgeries. And just to reiterate, the documents in closed packet number 1 were those documents that were given by Gorbachev to Yeltsin, and by Yeltsin to the Poles, and then published, put online, published in journals, and appeared to prove beyond any reasonable doubt that the Soviets, in fact, were guilty at Katyn. And, of course, the Gorbachev regime had admitted this, and that remains the official position of the Russian government today. The official position under Yeltsin, of course, and then since then under Putin, Medvedev, Putin again, this still remains the official Russian version that the Soviets, the evil Stalin and his evil henchmen, in anti-communist language, were guilty and had the Poles shot. By about the year 2000, some Russian investigators had published some material that challenged the authenticity of these documents in closed packet number 1. I read their arguments. I thought that they did not persuade me, but they made me curious. They made me begin to doubt the mainstream story, now accepted by all professional historians, that they made me doubt that story, but I also doubted the doubters, so to speak. I created a web page and I put up some information that fundamentally said I'm an agnostic on this question. Here's a lot of the information, but I'm not ever going to get into this because, you'll never convince people on either side. So that was that. However, in 2011, a joint Polish-Ukrainian archaeological group, which had been researching a mass grave in the western Ukraine, issued a report, or at least the Poles issued a report. And in that report, they documented a couple of things that were interesting. I mean, many things, but those that concern us here are these. Number 1, the badge of a Polish policeman who was supposedly shot, over 1,000 kilometers away in Kalinin, Tver, in 1940, was found there. And secondly, it was clear that the victims in this burial pit were shot by the Germans in 1941, because many shell casings were found, and the Germans very conveniently dated their shell casings, and they were all dated 1941. Also, bodies of other people were found, including Poles, but also including women and children. And so the Polish archaeologist concluded that the victims in this burial pit had been shot by the Germans after the invasion of the Soviet Union, which took place on June 22nd, 1941. So sometime in 1941, conceivably, maybe a little bit earlier, but probably 1941. So I started to look into that. I downloaded their report, which is available on the internet. I had already been studying Polish, so I was able to read it. And I also, while examining this report and looking around, I found newspaper articles about another badge of another Polish policeman, which had been unearthed in this same area, at this same mass burial site, mass murder site. This badge had not been mentioned in the Polish archaeologist's report, but it had been discovered and publicized in newspaper accounts because it was pretty spectacular. And this badge too was of a Polish policeman who had been supposedly killed by the Soviets at Kalinin, and sometime in the spring of 1940. And Kalinin is like 1,000 kilometers away from this town, Volodymyr Volynski, which is now in the western Ukraine. And so, this raised the question of what were these badges doing there. It was assumed that the bodies were there too. Now, it's important to note here that this Polish and Ukrainian archaeological team did not do any DNA analysis. There were lots of bodies, and of course DNA analysis could have been done. But DNA analysis is slow and it's very expensive. In any case, they never intended to do any of that, to identify exactly who was buried there. And therefore, although the badges of these two Polish policemen who supposedly had been killed spring of 1940, 1,000 kilometers away by the Soviets, these badges were never attached to any bodies because no DNA analysis was done. Well, this, of course, caused some people to think that, maybe the Soviets had not shot all of these prisoners who had been shipped from the Ostashkov camp to Kalinin, because here were the bodies here was the badges of at least two of them, and there might be many more. So that sort of opened up the question again for me and for some people in Russia. At that point, I wrote an article which was published in August 2013, I believe, in the American journal Socialism and Democracy, and I gave all the details here, gave the background, and I said, well, does this refute the official version of Katyn? The official version being that the Soviets had shot all these people in 1940. That article was pretty influential. It was translated into a number of languages, put online elsewhere in various languages. French radical publisher, decided that they wanted to translate it into French and make it into a booklet. I said I needed some time to update it. I did update it in around 2015. By that time, an interesting thing had happened. First of all, the Ukrainian archaeologists who were at this dig and who had issued their own report in 2011 never mentioned either badge of these Polish policemen that were found, and they also did not mention in their report the fact that over 98% of the shell casings unearthed at this mass murder site in western Ukraine were German and were dated 1941. They didn't mention those things. And it wasn't by accident, because the chief Ukrainian archaeologist said, well, it's a mistake to talk about these things because they could cast doubt on other killings of Poles by the Soviets. And of course, what he meant clearly was Katyn. So by 2015, even the Polish story had changed. The Polish report had been taken off the internet, it's no longer available, and the Polish archaeologist who had issued that report was now claiming that the victims in this mass grave had been shot by the Soviets, although she gave no evidence of that fact. So she backed off her earlier statement. That made me suspect, and I still think it's true, that she had been compelled to withdraw the report and to change her statement because Katyn is a very important component of modern right-wing Polish nationalism, victimization of Poland. And Katyn, being a major example of that victimization, is a major component of Polish nationalism today. And so I figured that she had just been instructed to change her story. And in any case, she did change her story. So I updated this article. It was published in French in 2015. But I had the feeling that at some point soon I was going to have to do a thorough research job on Katyn because, honestly, I was still not convinced. I was in greater doubt than ever about the conventional story, but I was still not convinced that the Soviets were innocent. It just seemed to me to demand much more attention. So, meanwhile, other evidence had begun to come out, and this is very important. In 2010, a Russian member of the Duma, which is the Russian parliament, a member of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, produced and publicized what seemed to be drafts of the documents from closed packet number 1. That is, drafts of the forgery of closed packet number 1. A lot of material. And he said that he had been approached by one of the people in the team of Russian forgers who had been hired to forge these documents, to fabricate them in order to blame the Soviets, and that this man had, he had second thoughts. He thought this was an unpatriotic thing, apparently, and so he turned in all this information, and he gave it to a representative of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, because the Communist Party of the Russian Federation is, for all intents and purposes, the continuer of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Right? There is no more Soviet Union, but there is a Russian Federation, so he gave it to them. And this Russian Duma member, Viktor Ilyukhin, published this material. And one of the interesting things about it is that the mainstream press, with almost no exceptions, in Russia, ignored this. This is a huge story, of course. And since the mainstream press in Russia ignored it, only the left-wing press and those people who were already questioning and doubting Soviet guilt at Katyn paid attention to it, but the Russian mainstream press ignored it, and the Western press, the press outside Russia, completely ignored it. Now, that to me was itself very suspicious. I mean, this was a sensational event that threatened to overturn. It certainly challenged a very significant story dealing with the Second World War. So what could possibly be a justifiable explanation for ignoring it? But it was ignored. So that happened. I also discovered that there had been some more research done by a Russian scholar, for example, who believed that the Soviets were not guilty. There have also been some more materials published by a couple of Russian researchers who are firmly of the opinion that the Soviets were indeed guilty, but they had published some primary documents, and those primary documents deserved to be studied carefully. They hadn't, I thought, carefully studied them, but they had published them on the internet, and so that meant that there was this body of materials that had come to light since the Gorbachev-Yeltsin publication of these sensational documents from closed packet number 1 back in 1991, 1992. There had been some more materials that had come to light that needed to be brought to bear in a serious study of Katyn. And by this time, by 2015 or so, the mainstream version of Katyn was fixed. The books on it had been written, the journal articles had been published, the collections of documents had appeared, in Polish and Russian at least. The story was basically signed, sealed, and delivered. So I realized I would have to go on and start all over. So by 2015, I had been concerned about the Katyn issue for about 15 years, maybe even 20 years, since the publication by Gorbachev and then by Yeltsin well, by Yeltsin, of these documents from closed packet number 1. So over 20 years, but seriously concerned for about 15 years. And I'd published this article, and then I published this little book in French in 2015, and I realized that I couldn't let it go. Okay, I had to, at least for my own satisfaction, get to the bottom of this. And I thought that because of the new evidence that was out there that had come to light, that it might be possible to do this. I wasn't sure, but I thought it's possible that this mystery can be solved. Okay, so that's what the first thing I did is I decided to approach this like a detective approaches a mystery. That is, to approach it objectively. Okay, we don't know who did it. We have to gather all the evidence and study it and come to the conclusion on the basis of the evidence alone. Now, nobody else had ever done this, as far as I can tell. The official versions that exist all proceeded from the basis of accepting that the documents in closed packet number 1 were genuine. And yet there was a very good case made that they were not genuine. So, but at the same time, it, in my opinion, was impossible to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that they were forgeries, too. So there was a claim that they were forgeries, a claim that they were genuine. There were confessions, there were, that is to say, recorded statements of NKVD men who had been questioned by Russian investigators in the Gorbachev period, and who had agreed that they knew about the shooting of thousands of Poles. 3 of these old NKVD men had been interviewed. None of them were talking about the executions at the Katyn site near Smolensk, but one had been in Ukraine, the other had been in Kalinin, and that material was available, although only in Polish translation for some reason, but it was available. And there were other materials available. But there had also been interviews of local residents by the Germans, who claimed that the Soviets were guilty, by the Soviets, and at that time the local residents had claimed, of course, that the Germans were guilty. So what to do? I decided that the only correct way to do this, to go about this, was to set aside all of the evidence that was questioned, that had been questioned, whose genuineness had been questioned. Now, that's what the defenders of the official version, of the version that says the Soviets were guilty, that's what they're not willing to do. Okay, but I think that that's not honest to proceed that way. For example, in closed packet number 1, there are those documents, but then there are the materials presented by Duma member Viktor Ilyukhin in 2010 that purport to be evidence that the documents in closed packet number 1 were forgeries. Okay, there were the confessions of NKVD men made in 1990 and 1991, which tended to support the view that the Soviets were guilty, but there were statements made in the Burdenko report to the contrary of that claimed the Germans were guilty. So I asked myself, what evidence exists that cannot possibly have been fabricated or faked? And I decided that there were sort of 2 kinds of evidence that could be identified that as it being very, very unlikely, if not impossible, that it was faked. Number 1 was any evidence that tended to contradict the version set forward by those who had published the evidence. Okay, so evidence set forward by people who thought the Soviets were guilty, but that tended, upon closer examination, to cast doubt on Soviet guilt, and vice versa, if there was any evidence put forward by the Germans that tended to cast doubt on German guilt. And it turns out that there is such evidence. I'm not going to go through all of it here, but I discovered that this evidence had never really been scrutinized in great depth, and I decided to do that. So I decided to gather it, all of the evidence that could not, well, all of the evidence, period, and then to find within this mass of evidence, mass of documentation, that evidence that could not have been falsified, because the people who produced it either didn't recognize what it was or felt compelled to produce it for one reason or another, even though it didn't seem to support their case. I call this the unimpeachable evidence. It may not be completely unimpeachable, but it's been unimpeached. Nobody has challenged. And to study that evidence, and I did that in my book. The book is titled The Mystery of the Katyn Massacre, The Evidence, the Solution. And studying that evidence, and that evidence alone, without preconceptions, without trying to prove that the Soviets were guilty or the Soviets were innocent, just looking objectively at it. It was very interesting, intellectually challenging. It challenged not only, my ability to analyze the evidence, it also challenged my own preconceived ideas, right? Because the purpose of objectivity, the goal of objectivity, is to study a phenomenon and to set aside your own preconceived ideas, to give especial attention to evidence that tends to contradict your own preconceived ideas, and to be sure to doubt, to question sharply any evidence that tends to support your own preconceived ideas. And that's the only way to really be objective, to operationalize the concept of objectivity, scientific objectivity. So I did that. And of course it took me a while, but what I found pretty quickly was that the only evidence which cannot possibly have been challenged, the unimpeachable evidence, all of it, either points towards Soviet innocence or towards German guilt. None of it supports Soviet guilt or German innocence. And I think that's decisive. That is, I do not think it is possible that all of the unimpeachable evidence points towards Soviet innocence, and therefore German guilt, but at the same time, the documents of closed packet number 1 or these confessions of these former NKVD men be genuine. You can't have it both ways. I think that the fact that the unimpeachable evidence shows the Soviets didn't do it is sufficient evidence that these other accounts, these accounts that claim Soviet guilt, have to be fraudulent, have to be false. There's no way you can have both of these things, both of these categories of evidence being true. Now, I realized that this, of course, would be very agreeable to those people, mainly Russians, and some others, no doubt, around the world, and mainly in Russia, who insisted the Soviets were innocent. This would be very agreeable to them, and it would be very disagreeable to mainstream Soviet scholarship, which had long ago decided that Soviet guilt at Katyn was so firmly established that it could not legitimately be questioned. That is, that there was something illegitimate simply about looking at it again in an objective manner. I realized that is in fact the case. Mainstream Soviet scholars, the mass media, all refuse to even countenance, even consider the possibility that the Soviets may not be guilty at Katyn. They refuse even to discuss the issue, even to discuss the evidence. And I understand why that is, although it's very dishonest of them to do this. I understand why it is. If you start to discuss the evidence, it gives the public the impression that this is an open question. I mean, why would you discuss the evidence? Why would you discuss it this issue if it were not in some way or other still undecided. And of course, the Polish nationalists, anti-communists of all stripes, the Russian government, the mass media want to maintain the fiction that this is a done deal, that no honest person can actually question Soviet guilt, and that therefore all of those people who do question Soviet guilt, like myself, are either some kind of quack, somebody who believes fantastic tales, or are, biased by their pro-communist or pro-Soviet or some other motive that makes their work unobjective and therefore worthless. So that's in fact the case. It is not possible to have a discussion about this question, whether the Soviets are guilty or not, because those people who believe the Soviets are guilty, those authorities who believe the Soviets are guilty, whether political or academic or mass media, simply refuse to have that kind of discussion. They do not want to upset their own apple cart, so to speak. They do not want to give the impression, even for a minute, that the question of Katyn is unsettled, is not a done deal, that there might be some question as to Soviet guilt. But of course, I'm convinced that some of them know very well that this is, that their position is very shaky, that in fact, an objective study cannot possibly conclude that the Soviets were guilty. And there have been one or two reviews of my book in Russian that have come to the same conclusions, and I believe that that is the case. So that's the way in which I went about doing this research and writing this book, and coming to the conclusion that beyond any doubt, unless more evidence somehow or other comes to light, certainly at this stage, it's impossible to honestly conclude that the Soviets were guilty. As you can see, as you will recall from my talk, the Katyn Massacre is actually alleged to have happened in 3 places. At Katyn, near Smolensk, which is what the site that the Germans uncovered in 1943, but also at 2 other places, in Kharkov and in the city of Kalinin, now called Tver. And then there are supposedly burial sites of these Polish prisoners outside of Kharkov at a place called Piaty and outside of Tver, formerly Kalinin, at a place called Miednoye. Okay, so that is the official story. And there are actually monuments, Polish monuments, with the names of the victims at all 3 of those sites. Naturally enough, the thousands of bodies that are of Polish prisoners that are supposed to be buried at Piaty outside of Kharkov and at Miednoye outside of Tver have never been found. There have been attempts to find them, unsuccessful. But as you would expect, if in fact they are not there at all. So what happened at Katyn? Well, certainly lots of people, lots of Polish prisoners were shot. The Germans were smart enough not to turn up any German shell casings at Katyn that were dated 1941. We're not sure what the Germans turned up. In their report, they put photographs of shell casings that can be dated to about 10 years before that. And of course, then they claimed that the Soviets used German shells to shoot the Poles at Katyn. I think that's very unlikely. It's very unlikely that these 4,000 and more Polish prisoners whose bodies buried and then unearthed at Katyn were all shot by one batch of ammunition. So I don't think the German report in this respect or in any other respect should be believed. And there's good evidence that it was falsified, and if you want to see that evidence, you should read my book. So the answer is nobody has looked for the bodies of the Polish prisoners who were killed, except for the 4,000 or so at Katyn. There's a story, both by Russians and also by Poles, that there's another mass grave not far from the mass graves at Katyn, and this mass grave also contains the remains of Polish prisoners, but it's never been excavated. It's basically ignored, although there was some writing about it some years ago. It's never been investigated. The Soviets, or they should say the Russians, for reasons of their own, probably or possibly in order to maintain good relations with Poland, have never gone back and re-excavated the graves at Katyn. It would be interesting to know what kind of shell casings they might find there. But they haven't done that. And of course, as I mentioned, there's been no DNA analysis. But that's only 4,000 or so bodies at the graves that were excavated first by the Germans and then later by the Soviets at Katyn, and that are memorialized in the Polish memorial at Katyn. What about the other, I don't know, 18,000, 14,000, depending on which way you look at it? How about all these other bodies? Where are they? Well, nobody's looking for them. I mentioned that these badges of these two Polish policemen had been uncovered in this German mass murder grave in Volodymyr Volynski, now in Ukraine, but of course in 1941 it was part of the Soviet Union. There might be many more Polish prisoners supposedly shot at Katyn might be in that mass grave. Certainly the Polish authorities don't want to know that. The Ukrainian authorities are also very anti-Soviet, anti-communist. They don't want to know that. Nobody wants to know that. The Russian government isn't pushing the issue either. And of course, this mass grave is in Ukraine anyway. So nobody's looking for these other victims, the bodies of these other victims. Now, Ukraine and Belarus, and to some extent Western Russia too, are full of mass graves of people who were massacred by the Nazis and by the Ukrainian nationalists who fought on the side of the Nazis. By the way, it's been established by other researchers that Ukrainian nationalists participated in the mass murders at Volodymyr Volynski, shooting, among others, Jews, women and children as well as men. So it's very likely that whatever happened to these other thousands of Polish prisoners who never returned to Poland, that they were shot by the Germans and probably also with the help of the Ukrainian nationalists somewhere in Western Russia, in Western Ukraine, in Western Belarus, and are in these hundreds of mass graves which are all over this area. But nobody's looking. Nobody's searching the archives. Nobody's looking at the documents left behind by the German army. Nobody's looking for them. But I think two things. Number one, the Poles proclaim, the Polish nationalists have also always proclaimed, that none of these men whose names they have as prisoners of the Soviets ever returned to Poland. We don't know that. We don't know that. We don't know how hard they looked. We don't know if they're being honest. If we're going to be objective, there's no reason to take the word of the Polish government or any government, as the gospel truth. That has never been verified. In fact, we know that there are a couple of people, at least a couple of men whose names are on those transit lists, the lists of Polish prisoners shipped out of the camps near Kharkov, Kalinin, and Smolensk. A couple of those people were not killed at Katyn. We know that they either made it back to Poland or were killed elsewhere, but actually no one is looking. So we don't know. But that's my guess, that they were killed, most of them at least, almost all of them were killed by the Germans and probably with the help of the Ukrainian nationalists in various places in the Western Soviet Union. But that's an unresolved issue because nobody's looking. Because to go out and search for them would be to concede that the Soviets did not shoot them all and bury them near Kharkov, near Kalinin, now called Tver, or near Katyn. And the anti-communists, the Polish nationalists, the Ukrainian nationalists, Soviet scholarship, Soviet studies generally, which is intensely anti-Soviet, don't want to concede for a second that the standard, the mainstream, the official view of Katyn, which states that the Soviets shot all these people, they don't want to cast any doubt on it. They don't want to have anybody think that it's an open issue. As for the Russian government, well, I don't know. I think they're probably, at least to some extent, torn. On the one hand, Katyn sort of tarnishes the otherwise heroic story of the Soviet Union fighting the Germans, making a real attempt to form a collective security with the Allies, being frustrated by the Allies, signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact as a kind of last resort, and then heroically and at great cost defeating the Nazis almost single-handedly, really. And Katyn somewhat disturbs that stirring account. On the other hand, relations between Russia and Poland are bad enough as it is. My guess is that the Russian government does not really want to make them any worse, and they certainly would make them worse if they claimed, if the Russian government were to agree that the Soviets were innocent. Also, since Gorbachev, the moral standing, if you want to call it, the credibility, the stance of the Russian government in the eyes of the world has been to a large extent based upon its demonization of Stalin. And that's still the case. The Russian government today, under Vladimir Putin, still denounces Stalin whenever they can. They don't agree with all the anti-Stalin stories, especially those that have to do something to do with World War II, but they accept the rest of the narration, the anti-Stalin narration. So there's a seeming unanimity that the Russians, hesitating only a little bit, a unanimity that the Stalin regime, the communist regime, was evil. And so, and these people, these voices, the anti-Soviet voices, the anti-Stalin voices, control academic scholarship, semi-popular publications, and the mass media. And certainly that's reflected in what the official government positions too. So nobody's looking for the actual victims of Katyn. Nobody's found them. They are clearly not buried where the official version says that they're buried, that is to say, outside of Kharkov at Pyatikhatki, outside of Tver at Mednaya, and so nobody knows where they are. But nobody's looking because nobody wants to disturb the official version. I mentioned already that the Polish archaeologist has withdrawn, who investigated the mass graves at Volodymyr Volynski, has withdrawn her conclusion that these are mass graves of victims of the Nazis, and now states that there's evidence that these people were shot by the Soviets, although there is no such evidence. So this is a really interesting example of what I call the anti-Stalin paradigm. That is to say, it is illegitimate to question Stalin's guilt in any crime of which Stalin has been accused, regardless of the evidence. Once you've accused Stalin of a crime, and this is just one example, although it's an important example of it, then it is considered illegitimate to disagree with that or to question it in any way. So it's a good example of the anti-Stalin paradigm, which exercises a controlling influence over the history of the Soviet Union during the Stalin period, and in fact over Soviet history in general and the history of World War II, world history in a certain respect.